Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I hope you've had a good October. I want to come on and share some thoughts and contemplations that have been really alive for me recently, but has really been brewing since the beginning of October. And that's the idea of the process being the point. And part of what I feel is important for us, part of the invitation of this current moment, is to give ourselves a little bit of extra space to process all the things that we've been moving through. So astrology is often used to look ahead for forecasting, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? Forecasting is great. I personally have been doing it for years now, but this is actually not inherent to astrology. And this is something that I found a lot of people don't always know about, especially if they haven't gotten super far or super deep in their astrology learning journey. To me, astrology primarily being used to look ahead is actually a reflection of maybe a little bit of human nature, wanting to anticipate and wanting to be prepared for what's to come, but also a reflection of our culture. And our culture has this kind of body tilted forward posture, I think, this overactive prefrontal cortex. And we often forget how helpful processing can be for us. And so part of deepening into process, in my experience this month, has been sitting with some of the information that came through and letting myself come back to the information more than one time. And in doing so, allowing my body to start to integrate some of these informations in ways that perhaps are not always available to me on a cognitive level. Like my brain might understand something, but it may take a little bit of time and repetition for my body to actually get it. So using astrology only to look ahead, and in fact, not just astrology, right, but really any of our spiritual tools, if we only use it to kind of do this anticipatory action where we try to fix something, or we try to solve something, or we try to anticipate, that does not facilitate good digestion on an energetic and spiritual level, right? If you think about the physical body digestion, often when I think about periods where I have amazing digestion, it's usually because I'm letting myself relax, right? If I don't have space in my calendar, if I don't have space to take a moment to really breathe during a conversation, I feel all worked up. I feel tense, right? And that tension makes it impossible for us to digest, let alone compost and transform. There is a need at this moment to remember not to continue jamming more information into our minds, but rather to help our energy body process information and make meaningful connections through deepening. I really see this in the current moment in Venus in Sagittarius. When we think about Sagittarius, Sagittarius is a sign that is ruled by Jupiter. And so Sagittarius has this expansive larger than life quality, right? As a sign, as a characteristic, as an archetype, Sagittarius does not play small, right? True to the nature of Jupiter. At the same time, when I think about Venus in Sagittarius, I think about the depth that Venus in Sagittarius can choose to go into. And depth sometimes can only happen through repetition. Because in seeing the same thing kind of over and over again, we get to see different aspects, different facets of the same thing, of some of maybe the same messages that came through. And in doing so, we give our bodies a chance to look at it from different vantage points, right? So to that end, I want to share a little bit of a recap, but not just a recap, but maybe a retelling of some of the messages that came through at the beginning of the month, and to deepen into it, and then to take it a step further. So the quick summary for those of you who are astrologically inclined is, to me, this month feels like a month where resources and the idea of resourcing can feel really scarce. Now, resources don't just exist on a financial level, right? We also need resources on an emotional level, on a social level, physical level, spiritual level. And you can see this playing out through the astrology. As we think about the beginning of the month, it started with the annular solar eclipse in Libra, which is ruled by Venus in Scorpio, Venus in its detriment. And right now, as we're closing out the month, we're moving towards a new moon in Scorpio on November 1st. And that new moon in Scorpio is ruled by a Mars in Cancer, right, which is fallen. And not to mention, Mars is already in its shadow period, gearing up for the Mars retrograde that will happen later in the year. In terms of how this manifests, you may feel like you don't have enough time or enough money or enough energy or connections to be able to do the things that you want to do in the ways that you want to do them. Now, this is where I want to pause, because something I've been learning for myself around this theme throughout the month is that my feelings are not always corroborating with mundane reality. And this may feel invalidating to the parts of us that feel those emotions or those feelings, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is that mundane reality may be telling a story that is actually very different than how you feel about the situation. So, to the extent that is possible, you may want to look at doing a little bit of an audit around this mundane reality. For example, you may feel like, oh, I don't have enough money. And that may be true, but you don't know until you actually go into your bank account and see how much money you have. Because you may just feel like, oh, not enough money is coming in, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes, especially when it comes to things like money or things like, having emotional support, it may be really important for us to take a little bit of time and make some space to look at the evidence. And so this practice of looking at the evidence has been really alive and has been really helpful for me throughout the month. It's been helpful to sit down and really investigate some of my worries, some of the things that are making me anxious, and to see whether sitting down and making space to essentially have tea with your fear is going to show you some creative ways to approach the next steps, and to maybe even reframe some of your experiences, right? It may also be the case that on a subconscious level, this feeling of I don't have enough resource is pointing to something else. It may point to some deeper patterns, a deeper cry for help, because what we think we want and what we think we don't want are very rarely reflective of our true desires. Our true desires often operate on such a deep level that we need to do a little bit of extra work to get deeper than the level of, this is what I want, right? Wants and desires, I've been learning, are not necessarily the same thing. You may want something, you may think you want something, but actually it may, if you follow it, point to a deeper desire that is wanting to show itself to you. To me, desire is an energy. Desire has its own spirit. And in order for us to really connect with the spirit of that desire, often we need to have a little bit of extra space between our sense of identity and that desire. And sometimes the things we think we want can get in the way of us being able to clearly see that desire. It's also true that some desires take time to reveal itself to us. I believe this is also one of those Venus in Sagittarius learnings that we are being invited to deepen into at this moment. That Venus as the principle of desire, as the principle of harmony, as the principle of connection in the sign of Sagittarius, which has to do with expansiveness, breadth, but also depth, is speaking to how our desire nature wants to court us. Our desire nature wants us to go on this adventure in order to uncover it. An example that came up for me was I have seen myself getting pissed at my apartment being a mess. And I may think that what I really need is a clean apartment. But if I were to be really honest with you, I am a Virgo rising. I know how to clean things up. So why is my apartment not clean yet? And why am I really torn up about it? Why am I making a big deal out of it? Turns out what I'm realizing is I'm actually not that bothered by my apartment. What bothered me is there's this sense within me that I am not where I'm supposed to be in my life. And my apartment being messy kind of reflects that back to me. But in order for me to really get into that deeper layer of fear and anxiety about my life not being where I want it to be or where I think it should be, I need to consider the possibility that the messy apartment is not the real problem. Not to gaslight myself into thinking, oh, my apartment never needs to be cleaned up, but to really ask myself to go deeper, to ask myself to be more honest, to ask myself to be willing to embrace the pain, the shame, and the hatred that may come up when I finally realize that it's not about my messy apartment. That's deep work. And especially when we think about the context that we're currently living in, we are seeing so much collective pain. We are seeing ongoing war that doesn't have any end in sight. We are looking at many instances of climate crisis. And so, to me, this can both amplify our pain and also sometimes obscure that pain. It's easier to look outside. It's easier to blame this government or that leader not doing the right thing rather than to really understand what is making us feel the way we're feeling right now, right? It may be really hard for us to tend to that personal pain. So that's not to say that we're not here to tend to some of these collective problems, right? Absolutely tend to the collective problems if that's what you're feeling called to. And also, it may be important for you to make space to listen to the very personal pain. And that very personal pain, if you continue to get closer to it, to talk to that pain as if that pain is a friend rather than a problem that you need to be removing from your life, you might find that that pain slowly begins to step aside and show you the true desire. Another piece that came through at the beginning of the month was a reminder that hope is a resource, that prayer is a resource, that communal support is a resource, that encouragement is a resource, and that connection is a resource. And to embody being that resource in our lives. This is not an invitation to be Pollyanna, to not acknowledge the things that are lacking in our lives, the things that we actually need to be able to survive. This is not an invitation to set aside our feelings or deny ourselves of feeling the feelings, but rather to remember that there's often agency. And the process of returning to agency is a practice. And like any other practice, it requires willingness and it requires consistency. So here are some things that I've been experiencing and I've been thinking about. That the heart of all of this, the heart of the invitation to embody the resource, is to allow the process to be the point. There's an invitation to be willing to work on a longer timeline. There's an invitation to set aside urgency. There's an invitation to set aside the desire to please other people or to impress other people on terms that are not ultimately ours, and that doesn't honor our unique way of moving through the world. Something that your mind thinks will only take 1 week may actually take a lot longer. And the invitation that I've had to really sit with is the idea that baking in that time to expand the timeline that my mind thinks something needs to be completed within is to give myself the gift of time. And we often think of time as our enemy, but there's also that is a perspective. That is just one of many perspectives. That is just one of many storylines. And in the cases where we are confronted with multiple storylines, often the invitation is to ask which storyline is regenerative for us, which storyline is life-giving. And is it life-giving for you to consider time as your enemy right now? For me, throughout my journey, sometimes that's true. There have been times where I do need to work with a little bit of additional urgency so that I can move things along a little bit faster. But especially in this moment, thinking about Mars and Cancer, I do think that recognizing time as a resource and baking in extra spaciousness in our schedule is a gift for both ourselves and for others. And often what we learn on the other end of it is if we're feeling overwhelmed, chances are people on the other side also feel overwhelmed. That our experience on a personal level is not just something we are responsible for, but something that the communal we or the collective we are responsible for. That we are fractals of this larger web of life that we exist within. And so, remembering that alchemy doesn't happen without digestion. Alchemy doesn't happen without composting. Alchemy doesn't happen without rotting. I once sat in a lecture on fermenting, and I remember being completely in awe and being entranced by what the lecturer was sharing about how bacteria had to rot the original materia, right? For example, like cabbage or cucumbers, in order for fermentation to happen. That fermentation is basically the act of allowing things to go bad with a little bit of art, right? So that we stop that process before it gets toxic. Similarly, a lot of the things that truly matter in our lives need that time to grow. But then in order for it to reach its final form, sometimes we have to also let it rot. This is something that our culture, in its desire for never-ending, constant, forward-moving progress, often doesn't teach us, right? I'm thinking about, for example, the idea of building muscles, that in order to build muscles, we need to kind of break down some of the other muscles that are already there. I am no expert in this particular subject matter, so those of you listening who are experts in muscle building, I apologize if this is butchering the spirit of it or the details of it. But there's something here about how, in order to come to the iteration that feels right, the iteration that on a form level feels honoring to the spirit of the creation, sometimes we need to let things shift a little bit, to let things dim, to maybe let things feel regressive. We live within a culture that prizes never-ending creation, that we're always needing to create new things. I recently recorded a conversation with my friend Emily Bingham about this. Emily is a journalist, and we talked about the idea of content creation and how that's created this culture of trying to churn out things that don't always have substance, or churning out things before we're ready to actually really share them. So be on the lookout. It's a great episode. It's going to come soon. But I want to share with you a Rumi poem that a teacher once shared with a class that I was in that has really impacted me over the years. I have come to drag you out of yourself and take you into my heart. I have come to bring out the beauty you never knew you had and lift you like a prayer to the sky. If no one recognizes you, I do, because you are my life and soul. Don't run away. Accept your wounds and let bravery be your shield. It takes 1,000 stages for the perfect being to evolve. Every step of the way I will walk with you and never leave you stranded. Be patient. Do not open the lid too soon. Simmer away until you are ready. That is always such a beautiful poem. One of these days I'm going to make a song out of it because I love it so much. What I think is so interesting about this poem is that Rumi talked about dragging you out of yourself, and also talked about being patient and not opening the lid too soon, and how it takes 1,000 stages for the perfect being to evolve. The art of iteration is something that we can learn and something we can deepen into. The art of iteration is a practice like anything else. And so I'm going to leave you with this contemplation, which is, what is your relationship to working without pressure? What is your relationship with working without an oppressive hand crushing you, telling you that you are no good if you can't finish this? Because I can tell you about my relationship with this. I have a lot of fear, and I don't have a lot of trust when it comes to working without pressure. I've been thinking about the difference between procrastinating, or perhaps more accurately, the relationship between procrastinating and rushing towards the finish line. often I find myself not trusting that I can really finish things in a languid manner. And there's good reasons for this. I don't really know how to. There's an art and a craft to learning to work in the pace that's right for me, which is often kind of like in this slightly devilish pace. Like I like to work hard and fast, but also at the same time, maybe leaving things behind and letting it sit, letting it do its own magic without my intervention, without my toying around with it. And I suspect that this is not just me, that the art of iteration, which includes letting things sit, letting things tend to itself, trusting that every creation has its spirit, every relationship has its spirit, and things have their own timeline. These are not things that we have been taught to practice. These are not things that we know how to do. Many of us learn to rely on external pressures like deadlines or unrealistic goals in order to whip ourselves into a frenzy so that we can get things done. And we believe over time that the frenzy is what helps us get the things done. And on some level, that's true. But there's a distinction here that we need to make between getting things done and feeling the relief of that completion versus actually cherishing and living out the process, which can, if you choose to, give you deep satisfaction about how the work itself is nourishing you. I've been returning to the work of someone named Timothy Keller. I actually used to, when I was still going to church, I used to go to a church that he founded here in New York City. But recently my mom sent me a podcast episode where Tim Keller was talking about work and was talking about resting. And for a while, I could not stand to listen to Christian sermons because it triggered me too much. But I'm getting to a point where I'm really enjoying some of them, actually. And I'm able to see them from a different perspective and have a little bit more spaciousness around them. And what I'm learning listening to that particular sermon was this idea that rest is essential to the work. This is something that our culture doesn't always understand and doesn't always know how to have a relationship with. Even when we talk about resting, we talk about resting in excess. We talk about resting as quitting everything, right? Taking a nap all the time, which can be nice. I think for some people that's true. But I also have found in my own journey that I love working. That certain kinds of work, the right kind of work, with the right people, on the right project, is deeply nourishing to my soul. And so I don't want to not work because I love aspects of that work. And also, can I really give myself permission to work in the ways that feel nourishing to me, right? I am also reminded of something that Ra, the founder of human design, has said in the past, which is that life is pressure, right? That you can't get rid of the pressure fully because life is pressure. The only way to get rid of it is essentially to die. And so, what does it mean to choose to be nourished by the work itself by infusing deep presence? What does it mean to nourish the work by giving ourselves permission to rest? And then, when the internal call comes in, to apply ourselves again to the work with not a lot of pressure, maybe, with expectations that are open, that are exciting, that are life-giving. What does it mean to choose to prioritize the process, to trust the process, and allow that to be a spiritual practice? So what I'll add to the transmission at the beginning of the month is that patience is a resource. Iteration is a resource. Trial and error is a resource. And reframing failure as the act of continuing to iterate, understanding what our minds consider failure as just one middle ground between where we were and where we're going, that in itself is also a resource. Jupiter in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces, to me, also speaks to the beauty of returning to something over and over again, like a painter adding more layers of paint onto a specific area to achieve the color that they envisioned. It's an act of love. There's something about the mutable signs that are teaching us that sometimes what feels like busy work is actually devotion. That part of our devotional work can look like giving ourselves permission to come back to something over and over again and not to place an unrealistic expectation of what being finished looks like. All right, I think that's it by way of what I want to share with all of you. I'm so grateful that you're here. If you're listening all the way to the end, thank you. I hope this is nourishing. I hope this is helpful. I hope that this reminder feels timely for you. And I look forward to gathering again here in this space with you whenever you tune in. Sending you lots of love and wishing you a beautiful rest of the month.